Good afternoon. Welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian, and I'm happy to be co-hosting in studio here in Tucson, Arizona, with one of our pastors, Sean Richards.
It's good
What's
to
up,
be
brother? How you doing, man?
Had a lot to prepare for today's message, so hopefully this will come out as clear as it was taken in.
Nice. Well, welcome to Apologetics Monday. Again, my name is Adrian, and today, on Monday, for A Reason for Hope, we will be laser focusing on a very critical topic, one responding to the atheists' arguments against Christian faith, not just in general about being skeptical or not believing in supernatural things, the worldview we often refer to as naturalism, but just the idea that I don't believe that God exists, and therefore I'm going to respond to religious worldviews that do hold that a God or the God or something beyond what we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell exists. And so when often these responses are given, a lot of times they'll go to find out natural explanations or cultural explanations for why religions evolve the way they do, why they explode the way they do. And so today is really no different in responding to what skeptics would deem as a myth, the myth of Christianity. So that's what we're going to be covering today. But if you are new, there are multiple ways you can engage with us. This is a Bible answer program where we take questions live off the cuff from our audience every Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can catch us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is A Reason for Hope. You can also catch us on Facebook, which is our church's Facebook page, CCF Tucson, or you can just look at the link there on screen. If you're listening on the radio, these are always broadcast the day after, so if you want to chime in live, you'll have to join us on social media. You can also catch the program on X by following our senior pastor. His handle is Scott R4H. That's Pastor Scott Richards. That's Scott with a double T, the letter R, the number 4, the letter H. And you can either DM your question or you can just use the chat. We're monitoring these all throughout the program. And if we don't get to your question, we will get to it the next day. If you want to avoid social media, you can go to our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com, hit that watch live tab, and you can not only use a chat box there without having an account, but you can also make prayer requests. So if you have something that you'd like to be sent to our prayer team, take advantage of that, because that's why our team there exists. And if you're part of our community, even if you're not, we'd love to go before the Lord on your behalf. You can also email your questions, and our email address for the program is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@hope.org. Now, on Mondays, we do laser focus, like I said, and so we will take questions, but usually towards the end of the program, and questions pertaining to today's topic. So if you do have a question that's sort of outside that lane, then we'll save it for us later on in the week, and we'll get to it. Otherwise, if you do have a question pertaining to the accusation that Christianity or the person of Jesus is just a myth or a copy of mythology, then we would love to take your questions. And there are a lot of angles that you could ask about that, eyewitness accounts, and so on. So happy to take those questions. We'll take a moment to pray, and then we'll get into today's topic.
Sounds fun. Well, thank you for the honor you've given us to be in your word among your people, and we pray in your spirit. All this is an issue that certainly causes us to expect more of our audience than oftentimes can be expected of them. We pray that the time that was spent not only preparing this information would give us a not only desire to communicate truth, but a spirit of graciousness in how to present it, that even though there are those that will knowingly lie in order to blaspheme, curse, or dismiss you, we ask that we would simply present the truth and allow it to stand on its own merits. We thank you for giving us the truth. Your word is truth. Fill us with it now, and we pray that you would be honored by the time spent here. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen, amen. Thank you, Sean, and thanks for taking the time to prepare these. And he does spend a lot of time preparing these Apologetics Mondays. Can I reveal the next area that we're going to cover after we're finished with atheism?
Yeah, and they'll be in about 3 weeks.
Awesome. So we're going to be covering
Jehovah's Witnesses, a.k.a. the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, a.k.a. Modern Arianism, a.k.a. everything you've wanted to know about the deity of Christ but were afraid to ask.
All right. That'll be exciting. But we're going to wrap up our series on responding to atheists' arguments against not just faith in general, but Christian faith, and today is no different. Was Jesus a myth? I've heard this argument oftentimes where people will say, oh, well, the writers of the New Testament clearly wrote much, much later, and they just copied from these ancient mythologies.
Yeah.
Look at all the parallels, all the similarities. And so Jesus is really like Santa Claus. Maybe there was a real man named Jesus. Maybe he was a revolutionary. But pretty much the Jesus of faith is no different than reindeer and the North Pole and presents under our trees as far as the beliefs. It's as ridiculous as that.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously there will be people who are more rational in their dismissal, and people who, again, will force you to do a lot more homework than oftentimes the audience deserves. But when it comes down to it, they want to present it in one of three ways. You gave the hard mode of the options when it comes to naming a specific mythology that the apostles or the cultures that could have been borrowed from, usually because they're either adjacent to or have some thematic parallel to the themes of Christianity, and they'll just jump on whatever they can get and say, see, that's where the idea of Christianity came from, because, of course, this is an older religion, and as nobody in the religion themselves knows, every religion always teaches the same thing except Christianity. We're going to assume that, but not for you. Anyway, we'll deal with that more in a second. There's also people who can be, I suppose, giving you, in the realm of making it easier or harder, kind of give you a layup as far as the easiest that will be required to be proven, because the accusation of Jesus being a myth isn't just that Jesus is based on mythology, but just that the whole concept is a fabrication of its own, that you have your Hindu myths, that you have your Persian and your Roman and your Greek and your Egyptian myths. Well, Jesus just happens to be your Jewish myth, another cult that will ultimately come and gone just like any other group and has no actual historical backing to it. Now, if they say that Jesus never existed entirely, that he's completely devoid of history, as you said, then that would be the easiest to address. All you have to do is grant things that even atheists would be willing to acknowledge in polite company and hope that it becomes that in the person you're talking to. If they say that, as you also mentioned, there was embellishment, that Jesus started as a revolutionary in your terms, but details got added in. He was never really a miracle worker, but those things made him more dramatic, and that they had him rise from the dead because they wanted to keep the cause going. That, again, is a little more difficult, but we can consider that easy mode. Well, I guess getting into moderate mode compared to easy mode, because once again, it requires a bit of knowledge on the foundations of Christianity, which again, this program exists to equip you all with. But the hardest mode is, again, when they say that Jesus is a combination of various myths that would predate him. Well, that again requires you not just to know what Christianity actually teaches when they make the parallels, but also to know the pagan source material. And most of the time, that's not the sort of things that people have in their back pocket unless you're used to doing these sort of things like we are here. So when we note and acknowledge that these are some of the more difficult topics to deal with, and you need to understand what kind of question is really being asked, as well as the kind of proof that is going to be needed to effectively deal with it, you need to note as well the intention of the person who's making this claim, because just like most people defending Christianity aren't familiar enough with ancient mythology to know those finer details they're pointing out, or the dates, for example, of when those stories became a part of those religions and went into circulation, or vice versa, the kind of person who is committing what we would call in debate circles gesh galloping or elephant hurling. It's a form of manipulation verbally where you overwhelm your opponent with as much information as possible, and if they're unable to address all of it, that suggests to the audience that's listening to both of you that it's at least an admission of some of it. And in the case of Christianity, to even grant one of the events of Jesus' life and ministry as borrowed from a pagan myth for dramatic effect rather than historical fact, it would be detrimental to our belief system, because unlike fluid pagan worldviews, we believe this is grounded in history. And if the apostles were willing to adapt mythology into the historical narrative, and I don't mean like, for example, Jude referencing First Enoch, or Paul referencing Greek philosophers in order to make his points accessible to his audience. But if in the gospel accounts they present an event that didn't happen, borrowed it from a Roman or at least a non-Jewish source in order to make Jesus more accessible, the credibility is shot because we have that kind of standard for our belief system. So the key, and this is for all of your peace of mind in this topic, is not to know everything about everything. That's an impossible task, or at least is very difficult even in the age of the internet. What's going to be most important for all of you as we go through this information is to draw attention to the tactic itself and test the sincerity of the person who's trying to use this cheat tactic against you. And if we can prepare you all for the means by which you're going to be able to either give or respond to a lot of information that's being hurled your way, both in this format and in conversations that bring this up, you don't have to feel overwhelmed because, once again, the best place to be in any area of expertise is to start with a foundation and then build on it over time. In the same way, we're going to emphasize the key issue behind all of these objections and then give you material to work with, regardless of whether it all interests you or there's one particular area that keeps coming up in your friend circles. That's ultimately what we want to do. How can you prove anything to anyone? Historically, that's where the question ultimately lies. Because if they claim revisionism, that's a historical claim. If they claim absence from history, that's a historical claim. If they claim delusion or perversion of history, again, that's the historical format. So let's start with understanding the most important issue without even touching a proper noun in this conversation. What is historical criticism? We've discussed it a number of times in the broadcast, but it bears repeating. History comes from the key word histor, which literally translates as eyewitness in Greek. Criticism, likewise, isn't just saying that something's bad. It would be the examination of the strengths or weaknesses of something. So in the context of historical criticism, if you can lay out what you're intending to examine in these conversations, someone makes a historical claim. Jesus was a myth. What they mean by that could vary, but they're asking historical questions. You then can respond in saying, I don't want to know whether or not something's true or false. I just want to know what counts as good or bad data, information, the sort of stuff that's useful in these kind of conversations. And examples of this can vary. We'll go through these when examining, where possible, any of the religious claims that are made against or for Jesus. We want primary sources or information material from the eyewitnesses themselves. Because remember, history, people were around to see it. It's just like with the illustrative story of a tree falling in a forest and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. Well, from the laws of physics, you'd assume so. But because, again, it's not historically observed, whether it made a sound or not isn't relevant because no one was impacted by it. Things can happen in quote-unquote history, but if there are no eyewitnesses, no one ever hears about it because, again, no one was there to observe. So relevance to it, or the people closest to it, are where historians want to start. If an eyewitness was there, what claims did they make? And there's strengths to this, obviously. If you're close to an event, or as close to the event as possible, maybe even a part of it, then you have access to details that other forms of historical data can't give. You have a unique perspective and can be asked questions regarding the finer details. Now, again, that also notes that you can't alter major details since you hopefully aren't the only eyewitness around to claim something. And if you have multiple primary sources, historians get excited because once again that means that they can clarify details that can be verified elsewhere. Doesn't mean it's true or false, but it means it's good data because it's directly relevant to the kind of questions historians want to look for. But also note that just like with the strength, there are also weaknesses. Primary sources, especially for things over 1,000 years ago, are extremely rare and limited to the details the individual themselves perceived. We can't time travel, so whatever they chose to write down or were interviewed about, that's what we have to work with. And the same is true for any forensic examination today. When you interview as many eyewitnesses as possible, you have to sift through the data, and you can only work with what they chose to observe. If they have, again, like say for example, as a witness of a bank robbery, J. Warner Wallace notes in his book Forensic Faith, there's going going to be some people who are going to focus only on the weapon, who are going to be focusing on the environment. Others, they're going to be focusing on the assailants and will only be able to give details to you about the things they were most focused on. It could be relevant to their backgrounds. It could be relevant to their personalities, their ethnicity and gender. But it's ultimately centered around that idea is historians want early information because that's where you're actually getting the historical meat. Doesn't mean it's infallible, but it does mean that is what we're looking for. That's quality information.
Now, it's important to note that it doesn't mean that they don't have an agenda.
No.
So if someone is an eyewitness and they're saying, yeah, I want to focus on the environment because I want my audience to know the environment of the situation. So having an agenda, which is oftentimes historical critics will accuse to say, oh, well, see, they're intentionally omitting something. Well, that's okay. It doesn't, as long as they're telling the truth about what they saw.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that they're choosing to share a certain perspective.
Yeah, and it's what we have to work with. That's good data. It doesn't answer every question, but it starts bringing up the right questions. So primary sources, that's important. The second, and this is the one that you kind of have to work with as far as the data is concerned, is not the first sources, but the earliest sources. Material that would be within the lifetime or at least within the culture of the eyewitnesses themselves. Now, obviously, high-quality confirmation of primary sources can be found with early sources. If you have information firsthand from people and then you interview other people who are from the same background but weren't necessarily there, you can clarify data that, of course, may or may not have come from those people who were actually there to see it. You can note that it is a reasonable source about an event, even if, say, for example, I wasn't at ground zero of New York at 9/11. I was a little guy and cognizant enough to understand my parents were very upset about the event, and later implications of that have obviously, well, you can speak for yourself as far as our Islam series is concerned, but noting that as the point in argument. Early sources aren't as good as primary sources, but they're reasonable sources about an event because, again, they would know where to look, what terms, what language would be relevant to the kind of questions historians would want answered. We also need to note that, just like with the primary sources, they have access to secondary details that, again, just historical claims can't necessarily give. If you look at archaeology and you just find a piece of pottery, an understanding of the culture and being able to draw attention to, look at the kind of metals they use, look at the kind of dye they had access to. That's not local here. We imported that. That suggests this came from somewhere else. Those would be valuable things to, again, ask historical questions about. Early sources are good. They're great for confirmation. They're okay when they stand on their own. And oftentimes in ancient history, it's the best that you've got. And when it comes to, again, associates of eyewitnesses, historians can work with this. Doesn't mean that we don't desire more, but it also notes as well that the weakness is that those details can't be verified. Just like you mentioned with the problem of an agenda, the fallacy of attributing motive, you might suggest. We also note as well that people can give false information sincerely, and note that, if it's handed to them by someone else. Now, this is eliminating the possibility, not guarantee, but possibility of someone purposely giving false information. There's also people who unintentionally are giving false information because they just heard it from somebody. They were adjacent. They read about this online. Look at all the discourse about Israel going on. There are people who are just rabidly trying to lie about the Jews, and there's other people who are sincerely appalled by what they hear Israel is doing. Regardless of whether it's true or not, they are a secondary source, an early source, but not a primary source. So that's important to note in a weakness, is that if it's not first-hand information, it's second-hand at best. And second-hand information can, of course, be misrepresented, which is why they desire the earliest possible information. Now, when it comes to transmission of religion, which we're going to be talking about here concerning Jesus, that's important because as far as Christianity is concerned, it is extremely unique as one of the only religions in history that actually has a primary source regarding its miracle claims. Now, again, you have cult groups and stuff that try to grift off of it, but at its foundation and core, we don't have the people who saw Thor, Zeus, and Krishna walking on the earth, just traditions attributed to them over time.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that these religions weren't taught, and doesn't even necessarily mean that there isn't truth to these things. Snorri Sturluson in the prose Eddas mentioned that Thor likely was a historical figure. He was a migrant from Turkey that married a drug dealer. But the point being made is, when we're going with secondary information, early sources are often the best you get as far as things over 1,000 years old. And it needs to be understood then, when Christianity has a primary source over 2,000 years ago about an event, that's huge, to quote Donald Trump. So let's go on. Anything to add to that before we continue?
No, and just to clarify, when you're trying to figure out who, when, what, where, why someone existed in history, just to sort of summarize the kinds of questions we're asking that if I want to know that the Jesus of faith is the Jesus of history, then I need an eyewitness account, an eyewitness testimony. And I want that testimony, and usually the way I frame it is 3 ways: quality, quantity, time span. Yeah. And you're addressing the time span. The closer I have these eyewitness accounts to the original date of these events, the more likely I have an accurate depiction of what took place.
And it doesn't mean this is going to come up when the atheist says, oh, so someone just says they saw it and suddenly it's history. No, you test the information, but we're saying, what's the good stuff here? Right, what are we looking for as far as quality? Primary is gold, secondary is silver. That's the point that we're making.
Yeah.
So, continuing, obviously, we can note just as much with the timing of the sources as how many sources we have. We can talk about the majority report of information, the general consensus of information about something. Now, again, this can go from the modern day to the earliest possible information, and especially when it comes to testing text, that's important when noting corruption. But in the claim that Christianity once was just about some rabbi that criticized Second Temple Jewish hypocrisy and then became the Messiah, you need a paper trail. You need to know the consensus of information and say, where and when do we have people just claiming he's a rabbi, and then at what point did more details get added in until he's the Messiah? Now, oddly enough, as we'll talk about in a moment, for some reason, all of the eyewitnesses seem to make that transition immediately after a certain historical event. But the point is just that. If you're examining claims, text, or ideas, you want as much information as possible so you could know where and when new ideas shifted in. That's also important when examining pagan worldviews, because they had no problem hearing a story they liked and adding it into their own culture, since these things weren't actually grounded in reality. They were just cosmological observations. So if they heard something like Christianity, liked the story, and then made up a god about it, that could be expected from their culture, because as we see from the majority sources, there's a lot of early stuff that was pretty vague and a lot more specific stuff that ironically started popping up when they were interacting with other cultures. And the same is also true when they ask it in the reverse. When did Christianity interact with these things? Did we see major changes happening to their religious worldview, theology, or understanding of who God is? And in this case, we'll just focus on Jesus, after interacting with Indian culture in the 2nd century, or interacting with later Greek culture along the missionary journeys of Paul and Peter. On and on it goes, but majority sources have a strength, because the more information there gives us to examine, the more fake data can be spotted. Now, there is a weakness again, because as you noted, quantity isn't quality, because just like when we talk about alterations to the Bible, and we'll talk about that a lot when we get to Jehovah's Witnesses, we're going to see that one bad chain of transmission affects everything else after it. So we want early information as the ideal, but the majority information, if you could note bad chains of transmission, that's where you note errors. That's its purpose.
And there's a good reason why we want those early eyewitnesses, because after about they say 100 to 120 years typically is when you start getting major myth and legend getting injected into a historical event.
Yeah.
So like if we don't have any sources, majority or otherwise, prior to that length of time, then you have a lot more opportunity for legend to be brought into an event. And so early is important, because then there's a good kind of a simple logical reason for why that is, and that is because once your eyewitnesses are gone, there's no one to counter any legendary material or thoughts or ideas. any contradictory sayings about what actually happened, people who weren't there making stuff up. There's no way to combat that until the eyewitnesses and their children are long gone.
Yeah, or at least not authoritatively. You can reference other people who knew this guy and the reasons why to trust them and so forth. It's not conclusive, but you need to be able to recognize the difference between someone arguing, oh, well, here's, of course, what the majority says, while the majority can, in fact, be wrong. In the majority, though, we want to note, have new ideas crept in? If so, where and when? That's
are there accretions in the events that are surrounding, first century Jerusalem?
Or 3,000 years before Christ, views regarding Hindu beliefs, where and when. Another one, this is really unique to Christianity. Historians love hostile sources, not just sources that were there to see it, but also people who weren't favorable towards a particular individual, cause, or event while still acknowledging it. The best proof for a battle is information from the losers, right? Because they have to admit to an outcome they didn't desire. The same thing is true when it comes to information about history. You never get a better testimony than that from their enemies, because once again, just like with the strength of a primary source, they have access to the unique details. We also see in a hostile source essentially double points as far as value, because there's no motivation to promote or embellish information about something they don't like. If, in fact, you find someone who's hostile towards a cause or religion or a claim that's foundational to a religious belief, that is not gold, that's platinum as far as value is concerned, because that's something you can use in and of itself, because there's less reason to believe it would be embellished. Also note as well that just like with primary sources, hostile sources are even rarer, almost exclusive to Christianity, in fact, because note that while late sources can be criticizing claims about various events while not being a part of the events themselves, there's also an even more important detail in noting you have primary sources who hated it but acknowledge key details about it. That's what's important. Now, archaeology and others, we could note people, places, and things that would verify other details. Archaeology's strength is, again, it's an excellent confirmation, but it's rarely evidence of anything in of itself, because while it can confirm settings or timelines, there's nothing in an artifact that would actually give you details about the event if it wasn't in writing. Because, say, for example, I find an arrowhead. Well, does this mean that there was a battle here? Well, I'd need more information. Do I know about the way they made those arrows? Was it a specific type of culture? Was this used for hunting? Was this used for... I can't know that. All I know at a fundamental level is that I found an arrow. Now, if someone claims that a battle took place here, that's a written claim, right, or a verbal claim, and then I find used weapon canisters, shells, arrows, swords, those kinds of things, even bodies, perhaps, that weren't disposed of properly, that would serve as archaeological, artifact-based confirmation of the event. But not, once again, if that's all I have to go on, which in some cases for world religions and pagan ones, that has to be a narrative that they have to spin on themselves, it entirely depends on them interpreting it right. And if you have no writing to go with it, archaeology is borderline useless unless you have something to guide the thought of what it's demonstrating. Now, multiple attestation, independent sources that all claim the same details of an event. This is the rarest form of evidence of all of ancient history. And if you find this theory, this standard for history in your account, it is sound. It is verified beyond a reasonable doubt as far as historians is concerned. Because once again, if you have two separate people saying the same thing without cooperation or exchange of ideas, it settles whether or not an event happened or not. Now, that then being the case, if you have that in Christian, pagan or otherwise sources, that would note that it stands on a lot more solid ground than someone who's claiming, well, they took this idea from someone else, despite the exchange being debunked by other people who said, no, I saw this as an event, totally unrelated from the first person who said this was an event. Now, I say something superficial, like I made my wife coffee this morning. Well, you confirm from my wife, as a recipient of said coffee, she might, in fact, be biased and collude with me in order to save me embarrassment. But if, say, for example, we leave my apartment, she still has said coffee and confirm it. The electrical company notes that the coffee maker was used. I wouldn't know how they'd judge that metrically, but the point still stands. We have security camera footage independent from me showing that I made the coffee. That's the kind of attestation or claim that's being made here. Two separate sources that say the same basic things about an event, that's as good as gold. Now, that doesn't mean that, again, someone saying, one source, twice, that this happened, that's still one source. But if you have, say, for example, an individual by the name of Matthew and an individual by the name of John Mark, who's getting it from Peter, who also confirm the same basic details about an event, that's actual historical confirmation, if, again, they know what to look for. We could note details of embarrassment, the things just like with hostile sources that you have to admit to. And note, this isn't by today's standards, by their own cultural setting. That's how you would judge something as embarrassing or not shameful by today's metric, because we've mainly been influenced by Judeo-Christian ethics. But the point being made is, you have no motivation to promote or embellish information if it would accomplish the opposite in the setting that it was being talked about in. If you're promoting a religious idea and you have to acknowledge when your God didn't get things right according to your own culture, they would either just not include that information. Why would they if they were making it up? Or they had to include that information because there's some truth to it. You can be the judge as far as the significance and scope of that. But just like with hostile witnesses, they have extremely rare tendencies to appear in anything regarding fictional or non-fictional entities, religious or secular stories. And it's only significant, by the way, if it's coming from an early or a primary source. So you have to make qualifiers for that. We can talk about anachronisms, but it's not necessarily relevant when it comes to fluid world religions, since truth isn't always a priority to them. But you can, at times, test the sincerity of a claim, whether or not it's early or late or not, based off of whether or not they mention things that weren't invented yet, and thus undermining their credibility as a primary source. Because if they say, for example, that Moses got in his 747 jet and took Israel to Sinai, well, air travel and that kind of aircraft were not invented yet, and they wouldn't be able to build one to accommodate 3 to 5, 7 million people. So the point is, you would see things that weren't around then that, of course, they claim are. That would be an error and evidence that this account of Moses' life was likely written today, or at least within the last few decades when the 747 was common as a means of travel. In other instances in religious claims, it could be something a little bit more superficial, like the material that they made weapons out of not being in circulation yet. This is more common in Hindu sources and traditions because, again, they were just compiling and making stuff up as they went along. But the argument needs to be recognized as the significance of this. What does it actually prove? So if we know what's ultimately being worked with here. You find an issue, it doesn't disprove the main event, but it shows the details you're getting it from is probably a bad source. Doesn't throw it out the window. Primary source or not, still can get details wrong. That's why you want as much information as possible. All of these things don't settle an issue. Maybe multiple attestation, but again, it's rare for a reason. We want to be able to reasonably deal with people on these topics. So if you can point out to an atheist that brings up this claim, what kind of evidence are they looking for? These are the sort of things that qualify. Reason to believe something else is more likely to be true. And if they don't know what evidence is, then saying there's no evidence for Christianity and you providing them evidence will obviously not accomplish anything. But if you take a step back and note, well, if I were to know something historically happened or didn't, what do you think I would want to look for? Then you could note, where were those criteria satisfied in the life of Jesus, if, of course, their metrics are reasonable. If they say you can't know anything happened in history, well, how do you know that you just said that? Because that happened in a moment of history. I can deny your credibility as an eyewitness. Of course, you can be biased and said that you just said those words, but of course you would say that. You can't prove your own existence at this point because every single thing within the space-time continuum ends up being undermined. But if we can be reasonable, then let's ask the question, what is the historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth? What would make him not just an existent person, but give us less reason to believe it was something formed from stuff around him? The primary sources of Christianity, obviously regarding the life of Jesus, we have 4 independent biographies written by Matthew, John Mark, Luke the physician, and of course the Apostle John. We have, again, John Mark is an associate and eyewitness. That is an early source, getting his information from a primary source, so it would qualify. The Apostle Peter, of course, being involved in that. We could note Luke interviewing eyewitnesses as his biography begins. We could also note the early sources of people like Irenaeus and Polycarp, who were disciples of each other and the Apostle John, when, of course, they were writing. We could note the majority sources regarding Christianity that, again, as far as the volume of copies and different information, both cultic, Gnostic, Marcion, critics of Christianity, and supporters of it, more information has been produced regarding Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure than any other name in ancient history. The volume just doesn't compare. We could note there are hostile sources for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Saul of Tarsus and James, the son of Joseph, were obviously hostile sources of his resurrection. They didn't believe he was the Messiah till they saw him alive after his public burial and execution, not in that order. We also have sources that would confirm his death despite the fact they weren't even fans of his, like the Sanhedrin. Talmud Sanhedrin 67a notes that he was hung as a living illustration of the right to have someone come to your defense before capital punishment was carried out. They get the details wrong, but they acknowledge Jesus as a historical figure, which would note as a hostile source. And since they mention his death, that alone would verify he was probably born at some point. Archaeologically, we have evidence that Roman crucifixion was being practiced as the Gospels describe it in the 1st century Judea. We have the heel bone of a man by the name of Yochanan, who was not only given a proper burial, showing that, again, they could be given that level of respect despite being politically executed and shamed for that kind of offense to be meted out with that kind of execution. But we also note the rusted nail is still embedded in the heel bone of his bone box. You can see it on display in the Jerusalem Museum today. We have the tomb and estate of Caiaphas, verifying a historical figure within the accounts of the Gospels. We have the Jesus boat, verifying secondary details about there being, in fact, a working fish market and fishermen-esque activities taking place in Judea in the 1st century. The ossuary of James, which again reads, "Here lies James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." Very much in dispute, but it would be the sort of things that we would want to look at. We can talk about the Shroud of Turin and the significance within that, which again we could do an entire video on. But the point and emphasis is these physical artifacts. You have a burial shroud that's got radiation burns on it. You have the outline of a boat. You have the house of one of Jesus' enemies. You got a dead man's foot. So what? Well, once again, not verifying anything, but notice these are the sort of things that historians would want to see to ground this more, not less, in reality. That's what we're asking. That's what we're looking for. That's what we find.
Real quick, just to summarize, the reason why we're bringing these things up is, again, as Sean has outlined, historical criticism. We're looking for primary eyewitness sources,
Which we have.
early, majority, consensus, meaning that these sources generally agree. There isn't one majority view over here and then this minority view, and that's the one we're holding on to. And then confirming hostile sources. We're looking for archaeological credibility, meaning that the peoples, places, and times in which the authors are writing about demonstrate actual firsthand knowledge of the region, the area that they're discussing. So there's confirmation. It doesn't prove anything, as Sean pointed out, but it does add credibility to the eyewitness sources. Then you have multiple independent attestation. It's not just one voice, but rather independent voices, all confirming. And then that standard of embarrassment, meaning that if these eyewitnesses are writing real accounts and you see embarrassing events being recorded, that typically does not go into something that's being made up. And then the last one was non-anachronistic. Which, how did you define that?
Things that fit the time period that, of
Oh,
course,
right,
were
yeah.
appropriate in that frame. Was Roman crucifixion not even invented yet?
Right,
Did
yeah.
Romans use ropes instead of nails? Did they use the St. Andrew's X design
Yeah.
cross as opposed to the cruciform T shape that we're all used
Yeah,
to? Did
little-
they use stakes, that kind of stuff?
Little red flags that show up in a lot of the Gnostic Gospels where you can see that the person who's writing this does not actually have an understanding of first century Judaism or something like that.
Yeah,
and
like
they're
we-
saying things that don't correspond to what someone who lived there would have said.
Yeah, or Gospel of Barnabas, like we talked about in our Islam studies. It was obviously written by a Muslim who's using the Quran to interpret the Bible, but when it comes to his claims about actual Judea, all he had to reference was the Ottoman-dominated territories and writing from the perspective of someone in Spain.
Yeah.
He made a lot of errors, though he got the general view as far as what his agenda was trying to confirm like.
And this is what makes that nail in the ankle bone so relevant, is because there was an accusation by a professor in the 70s that said, well, clearly the Gospels were written much, much later and not by eyewitnesses because Roman crucifixion did not involve nails. Well, then they found this poor 27-year-old guy that dated to around 42 AD with, guess what, a nail. It hit a knot in the wood, bent. They couldn't pull it out, so they just left the nail and the wood attached to the guy's ankle bone and put it in his bone box.
Which also showed that they could be given proper burials, which the Jesus Seminar folks said was not permitted for crucifixion victims. Yet we have a guy.
Yeah, John Dominic Crossan's whole point was, well, Jesus probably died, in some junkyard on fire or just rotted somewhere in the dumpster of Jerusalem.
But then we all clap our hands because you just admitted Jesus died, and thus this conversation is over. Because why would an atheist say that Jesus even existed if he believed there wasn't sufficient evidence for that question? And this is the point. That's all you have to prove. If someone says Jesus never existed, you don't have to prove whether or not he cured the blind men on the way to the temple.
And by the way, that is a historian's minority view that Jesus did not exist.
Extremely minority.
Very
they're
minority,
compared
yeah.
to Holocaust deniers, although that's become more in vogue. Point, though, being made is we have every single standard to determine whether or not Jesus was a real person. Now let's then move into the hard mode for this and see how far we get. Because when they say Jesus didn't exist, you can deal with that easily. You can note information even atheists would acknowledge and ultimately lead to a conversation where the evidence seemed to point that the Gospels are as reliable as history can be. But when it comes down to them challenging this mountain of evidence, they'll then try to shift the actual goalpost. Instead of just Jesus didn't exist or Jesus was fabricated as a figure over time, despite the fact all of the information we need to verify the Gospels is reliable is in fact in place, they'll say that, well, that material was borrowed from sources that are earlier than Christianity, which is, again, the first lie. Because, understand, a religion that is older than Christianity doesn't mean the material that we're reading about it today was always the case. Christianity is very static in its claims about what it believes and what it doesn't. It comes from the Jewish faith, which again also wasn't fond of sharing or adjusting. But if on the other hand you note Phoenician, Babylonian, Assyrian, Roman, Greek, they had no problem adjusting or compiling or building on sources because we see earlier accounts and legends being embellished and built up on each other to the point where they don't even resemble what they originally were apart from names and concepts, themes, and of course, ideals. But if they argue and try to switch on you the idea, well, I'm going to treat paganism as if it's static, that it's always taught the same thing for thousands of years with no evidence, while Christianity showing evidence of consistency in the majority reports, that only secondary details in regards to the translations of the information, not variations within the primary sources, not based on interactions, and not noting cultic views like, of course, the Jesuit movement's adapting to increase the numbers of converts, which again we talked about in the atrocities of Christianity. The emphasis needs to be based off of what can they actually prove, because they now make the claim. And if they say, well, Christianity is obviously fluid, despite our text reflecting the opposite, and paganism is completely static, despite the fact that it is within a culture and belief system that has no accountability to history. Their bias against Christianity to believe without evidence is ultimately what you're pointing out. The accusation towards you is actually present in this claim in of itself. But if, on the other hand, the actual evidence would demonstrate the opposite, you only can do that when you examine the sources. And this is where you run into the second lie, parallelomania. Which
I
is
like that.
yeah, it's a funny term, which again is like connecting the dots of ideas and claims in order to commit, again, a manipulation tactic called narrative building, where you only emphasize the things that you want to draw attention to while leaving out the sense in which those events were taking place, the culture behind them, or the narrative that those themes were mentioned in, as if they were communicating the same thing that Jesus was. There's really bad examples, like, of course, when they say this ancient deity was crucified in their belief systems. What they actually mean is that they're shown cruciform, which only means what? That they're portrayed in art with their arms stretched out. Now, there's a big difference between being executed under Roman crucifixion and doing this. I can give my wife a hug and be considered cruciform at the end of the day. It doesn't mean that I'm a crucified deity. We could also note that they can be vague in other issues, like they'll say they taught baptism or communion. Well, in what way? Oh, well, their rituals involved bathing, and sometimes they drank wine. So obviously the same thing, right? No, not even remotely. So when we're talking about addressing these false claims and knowing the actual claims themselves, it requires a bit of homework. But it's all resolved in one fell swoop by just asking for people to give you specifics of when those writings, not when those religions, but when those writings existed. And there can be many examples given, but let's just focus on a few major ones. They usually say that Christianity copied from Egyptians because, again, next country over to the south in Judea. Roman, because, again, that was the culture that Jesus was around in. Indian, because that was, again, where a majority of the early Christians began evangelizing to in the first century. And Greek, because that was the predominant religion and the culture that dominated the region of Judea and Asia Minor, where Christianity thrived. So let's start with Egyptian. Jesus was copied from the pagan deity Horus. You've seen this from Bill Maher and Zeitgeist and all the others. Well, Horus was the Egyptian god of war and usually treated as the son of Osiris, the god of the dead or the underworld. There's also other sources that say he was the son of Ra, but that, again, depends on your source. We have no primary source, unlike Christianity, regarding when Ra manifested on this earth. There are some dynasties around 3,500 years before the time of Christ where people were claiming that they were incarnations of Ra, but what that meant depended on the dynasty. The earliest source that we have is, again, in that dynasty where we see a falcon-headed entity in a dedication of the pharaoh ruling at that time, which once again is just a statue. No writing, no confirmation or context of details, just interpretations handed to you by people who are studying these things. The majority sources would note that we have 4 different real accounts of the life of Horus, depending on, again, who was ruling at the time. There was a rivalry between the north and the south, and of course that meant that in their desire to dominate the Nile, you had different attempts to co-opt and present the religion, and today you really have 4 different Horuses when it comes down to it. There's some who believe that every time a pharaoh was born, it was Horus ultimately asserting his interactions with mankind. There was also those who said he never interacted with mankind, that he was a cosmic rival to an Egyptian god named Seth, that he was a representation or even a manifestation of the Nile in godly form. Some considered him the sun god, others the morning star, where, of course, he lost his eye in a battle with Seth, and, of course, the night morning star was his remaining eye. There's other accounts that considered him representing the twilight because, again, Ra, for the most part, was treated as the god of the sun. Many others when it ultimately came down to it. But there's no actual solid version of Horus that you could compare to Jesus because there's no actual consistent one in Egyptian mythology either. Apologies to Moon Knight fans. The hostile sources, the only one that we actually have as far as an enemy of Egyptian culture that would report on the worship of Horus, note not the events of Horus, but around 400 years before Christianity, Herodotus mentioned that the Egyptians were an extremely religious people. not exactly detailed notes into their worship or the accounts of Horus's life, which is why the only time we get a real insight to this is after Alexander the Great unified this region and built Alexandria, that we see people wanting to put together more detailed accounts. That's why Plutarch, around 100 years after Christianity, actually started writing things down. Osiris and Isis's myth were popularized because, again, Isis worship was becoming popular in the Greek world at this time, and that included a conception story of Horus. But guess what? That's after Christianity, not during or before. So what do you do about the claim? Archaeologically, again, the Egyptians knew how to build stuff, or at least they knew how to make other people build their stuff. But nonetheless, we have an incredible number of inscriptions in ancient temples, but the accounts varied based on location and time, which again would demonstrate a fluid belief system rather than an actual historical basis they were trying to stick to. The actual written sources would be about in the dozens, because again, until the time of the Rosetta Stone, we can't translate Egyptian hieroglyphs in any meaningful way. But nonetheless, they did write some things down. The only time where we actually got a detailed text was almost well into the time of Christianity, if not for the archives uncovered regarding temples. We also note that the Egyptologists have to be taken at faith for, of course, anything detailed to be explained, and one of them, infamous Jesus myther Richard Carrier, is noted to more be a insight into his internet history than his actual scholarship. Multiple attestation, again, because we have contradictory accounts of Horus's story, they don't bother because they all mention Horus in one way or another. And when the Hellenistic Empire took over, they allowed Greek writers to document those stories, but not until Christianity had already taken root. And we could note accounts of embarrassment. Wouldn't be relevant to this, but again, Horus being wounded by Seth, that would note a weakness if this was your primary deity. Subservience to his mother Isis and others, not really looked up proudly at the time. Yet he claimed to be a manifestation of multiple pharaohs, even at one point, who were rivals to each other. So you can't ask who the daddy is. There was no Egyptian cosmic Jerry Springer to note who was the real father. On and on it goes. But because anachronisms aren't relevant here, let's just get into the claims. They say that Horus was the inspiration of Jesus' miracles, specifically regarding the virgin birth, titles like Son of God, and his number of disciples, as well as his resurrection. The reality of this is that Horus's birth is probably one of the later myths formed in Egyptian history, but it either has to be confused or maliciously compared to the virgin birth, depending on people not knowing what the myths actually say. The only reason this comes up is because he's the only one whose God comes into conception in any meaningful detail, and the details again change depending on the dynasty. The most common one is when Seth murders his father Osiris, who then became the god of the underworld, because that's where he is now. This is in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, by the way, describing burial rites. They compared this to the dealings of the gods. So when Osiris had his body split up into 13 pieces and scattered throughout the Nile, seems a bit excessive, Isis wanted to give the proper burial to her husband. And again, that's what's the context of this. So she gathered the pieces except for his private area. She made a fake one and made a baby with it as she took the form of a bird. Now, I don't mean to be crass, but a virgin birth is not a combination of necrophilia and bestiality. Just saying. Another one where they say that Ammon is an example of the virgin birth was, of course, where they got the idea of the angel Gabriel announcing the birth to Jesus. That's literally a inscription, a picture for all intents and purposes, in the temple of Luxor, where it shows that a guy said hi to a queen, or at least a well-dressed lady, picks her nose with a weapon, and then the next panel in the comic shows her with a baby. Now, I don't remember Gabriel fishing for boogers with the Virgin Mary, do you? Okay, so let's continue. We can note Zoroaster in Persian mythology, because again, Judaism is even accused of borrowing from them, who was a Persian seer that popularized the worship of Ormazd. They claimed that Zoroaster was the inspiration for Jesus' teaching style in view of the afterlife, but the reality is that everything we know about Zoroaster in actual writing, by the way, comes from texts that were written 1,500 years after Christianity was already common knowledge throughout Persia and India. It also notes that in the dualist theology that Satan in Christianity would have to then be the equal and opposite of Yahweh and used his bodily fluids to create the universe, Yahweh would then be trying to take him over. I don't think that's what we teach. We also note that Zoroaster never claimed to be Ormazd like Jesus did, but they don't draw attention to that. All they note is that he was a spiritual teacher and in later accounts performed miracles that sound awful familiar. But once again, where did the exchange come from? 1,500 years of history is a very long time for embellishment. We can talk about Buddhism, where we know nothing primary about him. The only person to write anything about him was Emperor Ashoka. Star Wars fans might raise their eyebrows at that. It was around 300, 400 years after his lifetime, and was the one who built all the statues that would acknowledge this police prince even existed. It was adapted later into other forms of it, like Zen in Japan, but any Buddha would be able to claim that title for themselves, just like any Jew could claim to be a rabbi if they had respected insights in a Jewish community. But to say that Jesus was inspired by Buddha's teaching and ethics is to not know anything about the Buddha Gartiya, our main source on any of his sayings, but also noting that even the Buddhists themselves note none of this actually ties back to the Buddha. The closest we have is one phrase where it says, "Do not unto others as you would not want them done unto you." Jesus said the opposite and the positive, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." They have to misrepresent the claim. We can talk about Mithraism, where they say that this was first century Roman paganism. That was where they got the idea. We even have hostile sources, Tertullian, Origen, and Eusebius, all write about criticizing its rituals and so forth. But when it comes down to it, the only actual source we have on any of it is a carving into a rock that details some of the worship rites as well as the story of his birth. They'll then take this and say, well, Mithra is where they got the idea of the virgin birth, the miracle claims, the resurrection. All of this came from Mithraism because it's the right location, right timeline. Where's the problem? According to Mithraism, he was born from a rock, not a virgin. Likewise, having any sort of connection with Christianity, it was already a dying belief at this point, and the only ones who could write about it weren't allowed because it was a secret religion. We can talk about Krishna, where again, one of the avatars of Vishnu allegedly was part of this, because Hinduism is a decidedly ancient religion, but it all came from a man named Krishna Dvipayana. And that's a whole can of worms as far as his credibility. He was even worse than Imam Bukhari when it comes to the history of Islam. Say that, oh, well, he was born of a virgin. No, he was the 8th son of a woman by the name of Devaki. She was not a virgin. He died at 33. No, he died at 125. He was crucified. No, he was killed with an arrow. Note that you have to be able to point these out on a case-by-case basis by actually reading them. We've given you a few, but the key is to be able to call out historical nonsense and saying, what would that even prove? Do you even know what you're looking for? Do you know what even qualifies as historical evidence? So, God bless you. We'll see you all tomorrow.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.